Good evening and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this special program on the Catholic Church, Society and Culture. My name is Piotr Bednarski. I'm based in Poland, near Warsaw. On our interview today will be with Professor Janet Smith. We are very pleased that you agreed to meet with us and to have this interview. And I want to express our warm welcome and many thanks for agreeing for this meeting. Before we start the meeting, I would like to make a few administrative announcements. This program is organized by lay Catholics in Poland and in Switzerland, EWTN and some other organization. I will be hosting this interview with my colleague Zbigniew Przybądźcie, who is with us, and we are supported by Łukasz Chmielowski and Dr. Łukasz Mirosław in Switzerland. This meeting will last 90 minutes and you can post questions in the chat box and we will try to answer as many of them as possible, but I don't promise we answer all of them. Following our tradition of these meetings, we will start with the Lord's Prayer to ask for the light of the Holy Spirit and God's protection. So let's start prayer in Latin. We'll see in a moment the text of the prayer. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et terra, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Let me say a few words about our guest. Professor Janet Smith is very seasoned and very distinguished professor of moral theology and ethics. She recently retired from Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. And she was also professor of University of Dallas, University of Notre Dame. She is very pronounced defender of the magisterium, especially in the area of sexual morality. She's an author of many books and programs. One of them is Contraception, Why Not? This is a program which was sold in 2 million copies. It's a popular program explaining why contraception is not a good thing. She was also serving at the Pontifical Council on the Family 3 terms, advising the Pope and various Vatican institutions on the question of marriage and family. She's very open to discussion, and really I enjoyed many of her programs, which I encourage you to view on YouTube, on various topics, including one of the recent one on why lying sometimes is permissible. But we won't go into that area. We today wanted to talk about conscience, about sexual morality, and some other themes. If I can ask my colleague Zbigniew to start the interview. So Zbigniew, the floor is yours.
Good evening and good afternoon, Professor. Let us first start with asking you to say a couple of words about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your journey. What is your background? What family you're from? What was your journey of life? And how do you start to become a renowned moral theologian?
It's God's doing, not mine, is all I would say. I mean, I grew up in what I would call a casual Catholic family. We always went to Mass on Sunday, but nothing really beyond that. We never said the rosary together or, grace on meals on Sunday. I never went to Catholic schools, secular schools in all my education. And I don't know if this will scandalize your audience, but I've never had a course in theology, let alone a course in moral theology. But I studied classical languages. I studied Latin and Greek, which I believe prepare you to do almost anything, which is what I've done. So I started out thinking I would be teaching. I got a PhD in Latin and Greek. I taught at Notre Dame in what's called a Great Books program. And because of my defense of Humanae Vitae, I believe I was denied tenure at Notre Dame and then was hired by the University of Dallas in their philosophy department. And so I taught philosophy for 12 years. And then I was invited by Archbishop Vigneron to teach in the seminary in Detroit, and I actually thought I was being hired to teach philosophy, and I was hired to teach moral theology. So the Holy Spirit has created a curriculum for me through my whole life where I had to learn new things. But I actually think my background in classical languages has been enormously helpful because it provides insight into the way words are used and concepts are used. And of course, so much of Catholic moral theology is based upon the thought of Thomas Aquinas, who based his thought to a great deal on Aristotle. That was very important to me. I was a big fan of Plato and Aristotle. As far as personally is concerned, in an interesting way, I got very involved in pro-life activity when I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto in Canada. And I did a lot of speaking against abortion in the high schools. And I did some sidewalk counseling, and I ran a pro-life group at the university. And I began to realize that contraception was a major contributor to abortion, and even more so when I went to Notre Dame. And I did more sidewalk counseling and seeing these young women coming into abortion clinics and wondering why they were there, and realizing they were having sex with a man with whom they had no intention of having a child. And it became clear to me that abortion then was their answer to the so-called problem pregnancy. I had also studied Humanae Vitae very carefully when I was a graduate student at Toronto with a lot of my very faithful Catholic friends. We went through it line by line, and I had become convinced it was true. I had seen many of my friends getting married, and those who were contracepting, there was a certain tension in their marriage that disturbed me, whereas those who were faithful to the church's teaching had a kind of an ease and a confidence and trust in their relationship that I didn't see others have. So there were many sort of personal reasons why I started realizing that the church's teaching on contraception was pivotal, it seemed to me, to human happiness. And I started speaking on it when I was at Notre Dame. I was teaching it in classes and becoming even more familiar with it. And no one else was. There was very few people doing any kind of speaking on contraception anywhere. So I sort of rose to the top because there wasn't much of a bottom. And people liked what I said. And it was an interesting approach, which people can hear on my talk, Contraception, Why Not? Again, available on the internet in various places. And then I started working on more issues, homosexuality, now transgenderism, conscience, bioethical issues. I published a lot. I published a book on Humanae Vitae that, gained some respect. So I gained some respect as a moral theologian. And, there may be an advantage in a time of great dissent not to have been trained in theology. I might have been trained in dissent as opposed to fidelity. I taught at Notre Dame, which was riddled with dissent, though there were also some incredibly wonderful, faithful Catholics, especially philosophers. Among them, the famous Ralph McInerney, who became a mentor and a very close friend. So I learned from the best in an informal fashion and was guided in many ways. So that's how it's happened.
Okay, and was there a single sort of breakthrough point for you to embrace Humanae Vitae, or was it a gradual process of growing to understand this?
Yeah. Well, there came a time, and again, I was a graduate student, and I'd met a number of other Catholic young people. This was in 1976, and the Catholic Church was just riddled with dissent. But all of us had somehow rediscovered our faith or discovered the faith and had become really devout Catholics. And we wanted to be 100% Catholic. And we fancied ourselves as young intellectuals and thought we should be able to defend the teachings of the church. And so we decided to read Humanae Vitae. We read also the documents of Vatican II. We read a great deal of Thomas Aquinas. These are all casual groups. This wasn't classwork. And we read the Bible, had a Bible reading group. So we had 4 different in a pro-life group. So the same group of people, about 40, 50 of us. And in reading Humanae Vitae, it just became very clear to me that it was based on very sound reasoning and a beautiful vision of sexuality and marriage. And then, as I said, that was confirmed in my seeing various friends getting married. And then when I went to Notre Dame, the expectation was that you would write a book in order to get tenure. And one of my friends kept pushing me to write a book on Humanae Vitae. He said, "You're passionate about it. You should write a book about it." So I didn't know if I should do that, not being trained in moral theology, but I retranslated the document. I thought the English translation was deficient. And then I looked up all the, I don't know, there's 140 some footnotes. And even that was an amazing education, seeing how the church's teaching was embedded in historical teaching of the church. And of course, read as much of the dissenters as I possibly could to read why it was they dissented from this. And I wrote my book, and that put me on the map.
Professor, can I ask you a follow-up question to what you said? You said that in your university years, you let's say reconverted to Catholicism.
Yes.
And this is a different experience from very many that I've heard about. A lot of people going to the universities in the 60s, 70s ended up losing their faith or going away from religion for a significant period of their life. What was the difference in your case? Why did you sort of return to religion at the university?
The Holy Spirit just grabbed me at the back of my neck. I was when I went off to college, I left the church for a couple of years, not but for any committed reasons, just that I figured you sort of wipe the slate clean when you go to university and you sort of start all over to think about things. And I went to a very radical school called Grinnell College in Iowa, academically very respected, but very radical. And I was very radical for about a year and a half. And in 1969, some women came to campus that wanted to work to liberalize the abortion laws in the United States. And honestly, I was 19, and I honestly it's hard to believe, but I really had never heard of abortion. That's how naive you could be in 1969. And I went to the library on my way to the meeting, ready to sign the letters to legalize abortion. And I read about abortion, and I couldn't believe it, that this was women killing their children in the womb. And I read it, and it said there that the Catholic Church had always been opposed to abortion. And the key question was when human life began. That seemed right to me. So I went off to the meeting. Again, I looked like everybody there, a little radical. We all look like John Lennon is what I say. And I'm sitting there and I raise my hand and I say, I'm ready to write letters, but I would like to know how we write them. When do we believe human life begins? And the people organizing went berserk. They just told me to shut up and sit down, and they didn't need my kind there. And I'm thinking, what's my kind? I'm just a sophomore in college. I don't understand this. And I think I was a freshman. And so after that, I started debating. People come up to me and say, "Why are you against abortion?" I said, "I don't know if I am." I said, "But honestly, the key question is when human life begins." And then all the questions came up: population control, deformity, all sorts of things. And I found the reasons of the pro-life side were convincing. So I'm walking around campus one day and I think, the Catholic Church is right about abortion. Maybe it's right about other things. And I started looking back into my faith and just found I couldn't find better answers to the questions I had than in the Catholic Church. And I was very lonely for several years. I had no friends who shared my views, isolated now and then. And then when I got to graduate school in Toronto, I found a great group. And I always said it was kind of a novitiate that we all put each other through. We read this. And we would go to meetings that would promoting women to the priesthood, and we would stand up and argue against that position. And we just started getting braver and braver and more knowledgeable on all these issues. People were stunned. They would all say, you're really smart people. You're at a really good graduate school. How can you think this way? It was really, they were shocked. But when they got into discussions with us, they found out that we were able to defend the church that we loved.
Okay, so it seems like it's your devotion or your love for the truth that led you back to the faith. Now, you mentioned a couple of sort of battle lines that divided you from some of your opponents in some of the debates, and one is the protection of life and the unborn. And can you tell us a little bit about your other major sort of debates or disputes? What lines did your thinking and did your combat against the world?
Yeah. On the way to answering that question, I also say I had as a professor, as an undergraduate, someone who was sort of a second Socrates. He taught class in a Socratic method. And I took a course from him initially on, in fact, only one course, Greek tragedy. And when we would read Greek tragedy, we'd read, say, Medea. And Medea is a woman who, because her husband had an affair, Jason had an affair, she cut up their small children and fried them in oil and fed them to Jason. And our professor would ask us, and there's in Greek tragedy, as you know, there's always a sense of impending doom, that the gods were not going to be happy with this, and there was going to be some terrible, tragic thing that would happen because of what Medea had done. And he would ask us if we thought that, sort of view of the universe was right. Do evil deeds merit great wrath on the part of the gods? And we were all subjectivists and relativists and weren't ready to argue that there was any right and wrong. And he was just always, he feigned shock, but, it's just really, you don't think it's objectively wrong for a woman to cut up her children and boil the pieces and feed them to her husband. And we were, different culture, different times, and it was extraordinary. And I'm sitting there, and at one point, students would say, you don't know whether there's right or wrong. And he would say, well, do you know anything? And I remember one student said, no, you can't know anything for certain. He said, do you know that for certain? He said, no, I don't. And he'd say, well, why would I talk with anyone who doesn't know whether there's anything certain or not? Are you certain that you exist? And he'd say, no, I'm not certain that I exist. He said, I don't know if I should talk to someone who might not exist or doesn't think he exists. And I'm sitting and he said, do you not think there's 40 pink elephants in the room? And the student said, no, I don't know. And I'm sitting there, I'm just, again, a sophomore, and I'm raising my hand and said, I know, I absolutely know. There's not 40 pink elephants in this room. And so that being, you're sort of just having your face pushed into the fact that there's objective truth and there's a right and wrong. This professor was no fan of the Catholic Church, but he had so many young people convert to Catholicism after having taken his class, because, these little minds say, there's objective truth. What's the institution on the face of this earth that defends objective truth? It's Catholicism. So that was a huge part of my conversion, at least really fortifying it, was being taught by him. So since that time, again, I've always enjoyed defending the truth. I believe that we have an innate love for the truth, an innate ability to recognize the truth, and you can't get very far in any discussion without making some truth claims. And so that's an advantage on my side. If there's no truth, why are we discussing things? Why are you defending your position if you don't think your position is true, why bother having a conversation? But so I've debated many things, a lot of times contraception. I recently did one on, as I think one of you mentioned, on whether all false statements are immoral, whether it's always wrong to engage in false signification. And that's a new one that's kind of fun for me to write and talk about. A lot of things on euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, bioethics issues, organ transplants, adoption of basically abandoned embryos created through in vitro fertilization. A lot on John Paul II's thought, who I think was an absolutely over-the-top, brilliant moral theologian. I think Veritatis Splendor is one of the most important encyclicals that has ever been written in the history of the church. It's just unbelievable, as are most of his encyclicals. I always say, he's a bit like Thomas Aquinas. He provided us with a body of work that it would take at least a century for people to, if we really poured ourselves into understanding what he's done, we would have something to occupy us in a beautiful way. I mean, his emphasis on the acting person and his emphasis on personal appropriation of the truth is just extraordinary. His notion of I've written an important piece on the irreducibility of subjectivity. And it means really the absolute importance of every person and every person personally appropriating the truth, not just not that there's anything wrong, that obeying something because God says it's wrong. But John Paul says that our real dignity comes in us saying with God, yes, that's wrong. I would never do it because it's not in accord, certainly because you don't want me to do it. And I love you and I know you're the source of truth and I will only want to do what God wants me to do. But also I am made in the likeness and image of God. And I can recognize that that is a truth that is coherent with my dignity. And I would never want to act less than my dignity. It's the greatest gift that God has given me. And I think that's not that truth isn't present in Thomas and others, but John Paul II brought it out in a way because it answers so many modern philosophical concerns that it's tremendous contribution to moral theology. So I think that there's much to do in the modern world. And I've tried to sort of follow the thought of John Paul II and write on some very pivotal, a coherence with the thought of Thomas Aquinas, and to some extent, never a divergence, but a deepening, a really deepening of some of the things that Thomas saw, but he did not pursue. I mean, he pursued so many things. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess judging by the positions that you have taken in your life at the university must have been difficult and must have become more difficult from year to year, especially considering where the academia has arrived these days with all the cancel culture and the silencing of free speech and freedom of research. Could you tell us a little bit, how did it compare, the beginning of your academic work with today? How difficult was it at Notre Dame during your 9 years there? And the following experiences, I presume, were in a much more hospitable environments. But could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, again, Notre Dame was maybe a little bit of surprise to me. I was quite young and I didn't fully know the extent of debate and dissent within the church, and had this sort of naivete that you go to a Catholic university and Catholic views will be greatly honored. And when I got there, I realized that like most universities, Catholic major universities, and many of the colleges were much more favorable to dissenters and actually very hostile to those who defended the faith. As I mentioned at Notre Dame, I had the great privilege of being a friend of Ralph McInerney, who spent his whole life beautifully defending the church's teaching in a very gentlemanly way, but very persistent. Another one was a Professor Fred Ferdoso, who became a very personal friend, and Charlie Rice. So there were, I'm sure I'm missing some important people, but I have to say there were some very good people there who really, really supported me, but the administration did not. I was not in the theology department, but the theology department was very opposed to me because I defended the church's teaching on contraception. So eventually I didn't get tenure there. Again, I've been a fighter most of my life. I love defending the truth. I do think it's something that is native to people. And when they hear it, and get it, they're so incredibly grateful. I never heard that before. I didn't know that. And all of a sudden, the world makes sense to them. And I love providing people with that sense that they have a mind, they have an intellect. These truths are not imposed on them. Again, they're friendly to their being. They're something that they recognize as something that God is not a mean taskmaster that is just trying to lay down laws that make us miserable, but that these are really vitamins, or I don't want to say they're things that make us healthy and happy. Maybe sometimes miserable, but you're kind of miserable. You're kind of happy being miserable, that you're defending the truth. And if that's where your misery comes from, it's not such a bad thing. So I didn't get tenure at Notre Dame. It was difficult. It was crushing, of course. I loved it there. I had good friends. I loved the program that I was teaching in, but I'd also had huge respect for the University of Dallas. It has a great core curriculum, and it's based upon the fundamental truths of the Western world. And of course, the philosophy department is a great anchor for all of those. So it was a much more faithful institution, though that it's not 100%, and that some of my views were very not welcome, but by the administration did welcome it, but a fair degree of number of faculty did not. But I was a very friendly place in many ways, and I loved it. And then I got invited to teach at a seminary, and that's where I never wanted to teach in a seminary. I'm glad I did finally, but a bishop asked me to do so, and at the time I was sort of like, whatever bishop asks me to do, I'm going to do it. And so I did, and it was very, very good for me personally. It deepened my prayer life enormously, and my understanding of other areas of theology besides sexuality, and just seeing these young men being willing to lay down their lives for the church, and asking myself, have I done that? I ended up about 10 years ago becoming what's called a consecrated virgin, which is a lay vocation for women in the world, where you take promises to the same that the priest takes essentially. And it's just been wonderful for me. It's transformed me in my psyche and in my spirituality. It's been absolutely remarkable. And so it's been an interesting journey where I got to a place where a seminary is a place where you teach young people, young men. We had women, though, in many courses. You teach them what to think. And I much prefer teaching people how to think. So I tried to do some of that in a seminary, but there's obviously not the openness to dissenting view. I mean, back and forth. You don't have enough time. I mean, you teach moral theology. There are so many topics you have to cover. And I love teaching things like Plato's Republic, where Plato's Apology and Greek tragedy, where you didn't have an agenda besides wanting them to understand that there's such a thing as objective truth. They can understand it. So I enjoyed my teaching in the seminary, but I did miss my teaching at university.
Well, let me do another question, sort of a follow-up. Is your expertise, is your research in the area of sexuality a pathway to your consecration? Would you say that knowing so much as you know about the sphere of life, getting as close to the truth as you did, does it lead us to make decisions similar to yours?
That is a fascinating question, and it's probably one I should take with me to a retreat sometime, and think about it. I never really asked myself quite that question. I honestly felt that I was sort of dragged kicking and screaming into being a consecrated virgin. It came a point in my prayer life, spiritual direction, where it was very clear to me that that's what I was supposed to do. But I wasn't that eager about it. It was just very clear it was what I was supposed to do. And so I did it because I tried to do what I'm supposed to do. And things radically changed after that, as far as in my just closeness to the Lord, my confidence in my ability to take on even more controversial topics. Right now, I'm working very hard on the sex abuse crisis in the church, working with a lot of victims. And of course, the church is in such a state of disarray right now. It was this come back to one of your earlier questions. It was in such disarray in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then the catechism came along, of course, John Paul II. And I was so thrilled. I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't know I would live long enough to see a return to orthodoxy. And people who believed fully in the faith were getting hired at major universities. Now they felt they had to have some diversity, as well as dissenters, as having faithful Catholics. And so we had a better chance of getting hired at various places. And most seminaries actually were filled with dissenters. And the fact that I was hired at Sacred Heart with a lot of other people who are just unbelievably devout, faithful, learned Catholics, that was unusual. I hate to say it, in the seminaries in the United States. And so there was a huge change. And then, unfortunately, under the present pontiff, there's been some changes that bring back all the confusion that there was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and more. I never thought I'd live to see what I thought was a forward trajectory stalled, maybe reversed. It's hard to say at the moment, but that's been very unsettling for me. But I do think the consecration has been something that helps me. I'm getting older, and when you get older, things upset you more. Oh my gosh, the world's sky is falling. And I thought it wasn't going to fall. I thought it was being held up by John Paul II and a return to orthodoxy. And now I think the sky is falling. And it could greatly disturb me, but I feel that the Holy Spirit is in charge. And I hope the Holy Spirit will use me however I can be used to help right things again.
Professor, I can't help but ask this question. Being an accomplished scholar as you are, one would presume that this is your vocation in life, research and teaching. Was your consecration a discovery of a new vocation, or is it a continuation of this? I mean, everyone is seeking for their calling in life. Everyone is looking for that. And to most people, once they choose the path, they stay on that path for the entirety of their life. Is it possible that you have a different calling now that you had before, or is it just an extension of what you had before?
Both.
That's my personal interest, sorry.
It's a great question again. And I think the answer is both. I mean, I'm a little bit not so inclined to want to teach about sexual ethics as I was at one time. It was, again, a passion. My passion now is honestly the Latin Mass to a great extent. I've discovered that. And I've been, I have 2 new big bookshelves filled with books on the Latin Mass. And so if I pick up a book, it's going to be much more likely to be about church history, the history of the church in the last couple of centuries, especially what has happened. But there was, when the whole McCarrick, the disclosure of the sexual abuse by Cardinal McCarrick, and the fact that so many in the hierarchy knew about that all the way to the top, and just let it happen. And I had known about the sexual problems in the church, but I thought they were much smaller than they are, much, much smaller. And when I went back when we had the sex abuse crisis in the early 2000s, and we had the Dallas Charter, I thought, oh, well, that's just a few pedophiles that have done horrible things, and it will be taken care of. And I knew there was a large number of homosexual men in the priesthood, but I thought the bishops know as much as I do, and I'm sure they're meeting all over the place, figuring out something to do about it. And then the McCarrick case came, and I was just flattened by that. I was flattened by it. And I couldn't believe that the bishops were so complicit in everything that had happened. And I started reading again. I have another bookshelf of books on the sex abuse crisis, and wrote a few columns about it, and people started contacting me. People had been abused, or priests who were trying to expose some of the corruption and how they were being treated terribly by the bishops, and asking for my advice. And gosh, I don't know what advice I have. I have sympathy for sure and compassion, but I don't know if I have any wisdom in these areas. I tried to gain it. And at a certain point, I remember walking around my apartment thinking, why am I doing this? And I almost said, it wasn't a voice from God, but it's that interior kind of conversation you have. And it was like God was saying, well, you're kind of slowing down. You're losing interest in what I've primarily given you to do. So I've got a new job for you. I want you to help these people who are fighting the church in respect to sexual abuse. And I have a very good spiritual director. In fact, he has me call him every day just to check in. And he was very much thought this was right. Discernment was correct, that this is what God wanted me now to do. And I do have to say, I feel an enormous amount of energy to work on this. It's incredibly frustrating work. The number of wins that you have are minimal, if But working with these people who have been sexually abused by priests is inspiring in so many ways. Honestly, most of them retain their faith, and that's unbelievable to me after the way they've been treated. And they still find their consolation in the Lord. For many of them, it's very difficult to return to church because so many of the associations of their abuse are rooted in something in the Mass or the Rosary, or something was used to abuse them, and it's unbelievable. So, but they still love the Lord, and they're beautiful people. I would say not one of them that I've dealt with has any kind of vengeance in their system. They just want to be understood. They want to be heard, and they want the perpetrator removed so that he can't abuse anyone else. The bishops largely don't understand that. And they treat victims very, very badly. So one of the things about being famous, one of the upsides of it, is that these people are victims that no one's believed, and they call and you say, yeah, I want to hear your story. And they go, you want to hear my story? I said, yes, I do. And they can't believe that someone who's kind of an official Catholic cares. So I have that little gift to offer people, that I do care, and that I've listened to a lot of them. So I've started to know a lot about how it affects them and how what they're going to experience as we go through the process of trying to bring the complaints before the bishops, and what is sort of the dynamics. And they're very similar for most people. So I'm learning something. I'm doing something different. It really does galvanize me. Plus, as I said, the discovery of the Latin Mass, which is the very positive side of everything. But seeing that threatened is causing me some anxiety, I'd say.
Yeah, it all ends well. We all return to the house of the Father, so there's no reason for anxiety.
The Holy Spirit's in charge. I've learned that over the years. I'm not in charge. Holy Spirit's in charge.
Right. But you are a fighter that the Lord puts in various places where He needs you the most, I guess. You mentioned your battles with theology departments or theologians in the previous university. So how much of the damage that's been done to the church and to the faithful is the fault of the theologians and their twisted approach to the truth?
Oh, enormously. I mean, it's enormous. Again, in the 70s and 80s, and when I was teaching at Notre Dame in the 80s, again, you would say the church teaches that contraception is wrong. You've got Humanae Vitae, and they'd say, oh, yeah, but that's out of date, and the theologians don't agree with that. And look at Professor so-and-so has a major position here. He serves on a papal commission, et cetera, et cetera. You are just a throwback. You are eventually they're on the side of history. And that's where the catechism was such an enormous gift, because at least you could point to the catechism and say, but wait a second, the catechism. And that was hard for them. They didn't know what to do quite so much. They didn't have as much power as they had before. And again, as John Paul II provided us even new, if you want to call it, ammunition to defend the dissenters. To some extent, they retreated. As I said, that was a good thing, but it was a complete mess. And it was because the theologians were in the universities, and not just the universities, the Pontifical Institutes and the seminaries. The dissent actually basically started with top theologians in Rome. And then it trickled down, Fuchs, Herring, others, and it trickled down to their students were students from all over the world, and they went to the top universities, and their students taught in the seminaries. And before long, dissent was the norm rather than the exception. And that those who were faithful had a very hard time getting hired at any university or any seminary. So the laity were completely abandoned by the intelligentsia, the theologians, and then, of course, most of the bishops studied under these dissenting theologians. And so you could not find a bishop in the United States that would defend the church's teaching on contraception. There were a handful. They wouldn't hire people into their family life offices that defended the church's teaching on contraception. The marriage prep programs promoted contraception. And so lay people are definitely, they never hear a talk against it, contraception, cohabitation, fornication, masturbation, homosexuality. None of this is ever mentioned from the pulpit or, honestly, in the classes on morality in universities. And so young people they never heard these things. I mean, if there's one line I hear more often than not after my talks is, I've never heard this before. Why haven't I ever heard this before? And I said, well, I'm sorry. This is the church's teaching. It's not hard to find, but you're not going to be directed to it by anyone in a position of authority in the church, in those decades that I've mentioned.
Professor, I don't want to hijack the entire interview, so I'm going to turn over to Piotr. But let me just ask one last question. Is that situation, that dissent that is omnipresent, is that aggravated? Is it made worse by the fact that a lot of the theologians are not priests?
No, I don't think so. I honestly think the priests are just as likely or more likely to dissent, honestly, than lay people. I think the lay people have carried the burden, if you would, of defending church teaching, largely because they haven't been through the whole corrupt education system, which the priests have been. And right now, especially, honestly, if a priest gives a homily against homosexuality, the chance of his being yanked out of the priesthood in the United States is pretty good. He will be sidelined for that. And I also think lay people, again, it's interesting that those, as you mentioned, those who were the most ardent defenders of the church's teaching were married Catholic men. Who were living by the church's teaching, doing the sacrifice, the abstinence, etc., having large families, having to support large families on a very small faculty salary, making huge sacrifices to live in accord with the church's teaching. Some of the priests were confused because some of the people at the top were saying, it's just too hard and lay people can't do it. And you can't expect people to be able to be chaste outside of marriage and inside of marriage. And it's just too hard. And all these really beautiful Catholic laymen said, we're doing it. We can do it. And it enhances our marriage. It enhances our marriage and it enhances our faith. And so when people say, well, it's, it's these celibate, gray-haired men at the Vatican who impose this teaching of contraception on it, I say that's not been the truth in the last 70 years. It's been the opposite. It's the lay people who have been defending the church's teaching.
Thank you. Let's switch perhaps to another theme which is very close to what you described. Could you tell us and explain perhaps why so many Catholic theologians these days, including those who are currently in Pontifical Academy of Life in Rome and some other institutions, have been contesting moral teaching of the church on contraception, saying about exceptions, the concept of intrinsically evil act, and undermining the teaching of Veritatis Splendor. We know that during St. Paul VI papacy, there were two commissions and they were against the Pope, in fact, and you can probably allude to that, together with very recognized theologians like Haring and Fuchs, who sided eventually with pro-contraception camp. But nowadays, we've got a sort of revival. Ralph Martin, during one of our previous meetings, mentioned that. Could you comment why this happens? Don't we have Catechism of Catholic Church, or there are signals coming from Rome? How to explain that? Because we see the confusion, and we see those people who are sidelined nowadays are in the full light, so to say.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to scandalize people. It's with some more than a little distress that I have to say, I think the reason is a lot of personal corruption, that many in the hierarchy of the church and in the episcopacy and the presbyterate are living double lives. A lot of them are in homosexual relationships and some in heterosexual relationships. And if they're going to live that life, they're not going to be against contraception. They do not believe the church's teaching on sexuality, and I'm afraid to say about a great deal of things. But it's a matter of defending your own lifestyle. That you have to say there are no intrinsic evils, and so you find a theoretical justification for it. You have an a priori. Your a priori is my sexual life is a good thing, and therefore I need to find the justifications for that. And you would say, I mean, why contraception? As you say, why contraception? I mean, so far as we can tell, the vast majority of Catholics are in fact contracepting. And they sort of say, well, they already agree with us on that. And so if we can just sort of say, well, it's not just contraception, it's the whole notion of intrinsic evil. It's the whole notion of the purpose of sexuality. It's all, whether in fact there is not just objective morality, but objective reality. And so it's basically, again, it's just, and I know that's one of the questions that's on the docket, but it's the whole notion of conscience. They've completely redefined the notion of conscience to allow people to do what they think is best, to act not in accord with God's truth, but to act in accord with their personal values. And that's where they think human dignity comes from. And I'm sorry to say, I think almost all of it is in service of not having to change their own personal moral choices. And I often tell my students, they think, give me a good argument. They'll say, give me a good argument against this. And I said, we have to make it clear that simply because people don't accept your arguments doesn't mean they aren't good arguments. Right? Some people will never, that they've got a position which they will not abandon. And it doesn't matter how many good arguments you make against them, they will not yield. And so it doesn't mean, if I could only say this, or I could find something this, and there's nothing that's going to work, because they're committed to a certain lifestyle that they will not question. I mean, I think back in the 60s, for instance, Bernard Herring, largely he talked about compassion, that he had talked to women who had so many children and their lives were very, very hard, and they were impoverished and tired. And that's before people really knew natural family planning, which is just an extraordinary thing, that it works and it strengthens marriages. It's good for a woman's body and her psyche and her relationships. And I think there was some of it was driven by compassion for what they believed to be the hardships of having a lot of children. You don't hear that these days. That is not what you hear. If there's compassion, it's compassion for the LGBTQ community, that they are feeling marginalized by the church and dismissed. And again, if you're against contraception, it's very clear you actually have to be against homosexual acts. It follows. If you approve contraception, it's pretty easy to prove homosexual acts. And it seems to me the a priori for many moral theologians these days is we have to protect the fragile self-esteem of people in the LGBTQ community. And we have to make them feel entirely welcome. And of course, they are welcome. Of course, we want them in church. We want them to be our friends. We want to associate with them, all of that. But we can't say that homosexual acts are in accord with God's plan for sexuality. We just can't say that. There's all the evidence is in the other direction. But they want to say in order to truly welcome people and love them, you need to approve of where they are at. And I was, I have friends in my circles who struggle with same-sex attraction. And before they came to accept the church's teaching, I don't go in, slam them over the head with the church's teaching. Basically, sort of ask them, are you happy? Is your life going the way you would like it to go? Are you feeling loved? Do you feel self-esteem? Do you have a self-esteem? And they began to realize that their hatred for the church was really a projection of their own kind of self-hatred, that they didn't feel that they were responsible for their orientation, but they weren't happy with it, and they didn't quite know what to do. Chastity is a hard thing for anybody, honestly. I don't know anybody who says, chastity's been a walk in the park for me. It's hard for everybody. harder, I think, for those who have same-sex attraction. And I think we've learned a lot in the church about how to minister to those who experience same-sex attraction. But we don't do them any favor by suggesting to them that God made them that way, that it's a good way to be, and it's perfectly permissible for them to be involved in same-sex sexual relationships. That seems to me to be the driving force in the church's moral theologies today, is how do we find a way to justify homosexual relationships? If the church is right about contraception, then we have to disapprove of homosexuality. So we have to knock that teaching down. And they think it won't be hard because most people contracept. They're right about that. And that's what's happening.
Don't you think that, and actually you almost said that the battlefield in moral theology and in church life is the concept of conscience, which according to the traditional teaching of the church is the adherence to the truth, objective truth discovered by our cognition, versus conscience, which is very subjective as a sort of self-actualization, according to Herring. And what this mean? What does it mean to be really a man of conscience? What was the motto of John Paul II? Be people of conscience. How you distinguish this concept of conscience according to the magisterium, to the traditional teaching, and the conscience which is now very much proposed, also somewhat by people who are close to the Pope in Vatican and elsewhere? What is the difference, and how to read this new concept, which is somewhat departing from the traditional understanding of conscience?
It's not a somewhat departure. It's a whole new concept. It's a whole new concept. The traditional concept in Vatican II says that the conscience is the voice of God within. All right, that makes us realize that we live under a certain law that we didn't invent for ourselves. All right, and so when I talk about conscience, I say, when you're asking yourself, when you're consulting your conscience, what does that mean? It means you start with the question is, what does God think of this act, right? What does God think of this act? We think in the modern world tends to think of conscience means, do I approve of this act or not? Do I approve of it, right? And radically different departure points. Right? The departure points, what does God think? Well, how do I know what God thinks? All right. Lots of ways. I mean, he gave us reason, he gave us revelation, he gave us the church. There's all sorts of ways of discovering what God thinks about something. And then John Paul II would say, then our dignity comes to really thinking about that and thinking of, again, it's almost a conscience thing. He would say, if I were to lay a law upon myself, what would it be? And John Paul II was confident that whatever law I would lay upon myself, given that I'm a rational creature made in the likeness and image of God, and I live in a world that's ordered in such a way, I would come up with the same rules that God came up with. These are laws that are in accord with nature, my human nature, and with the objective world. So if I discover that I hear that God says adultery is wrong, so I'm a married person, I'm really desirous of having a relationship with someone, and I'm thinking, oh, gee, would that be right or wrong? So if I say consult myself, oh, it'd be great. It might, in fact, even improve my relationship with my wife because I wouldn't be so demanding on her, and I now have someone that makes me happy, and I come home happy instead of miserable. So yeah, it sounds like a good thing, right? And then you hear that God says, no, God says adultery is wrong. Most cultures have, most civilizations have, common sense, the Bible, the church, etc. You say, oh, it says adultery is wrong. Why would it say adultery is wrong? It's a very surprising thing to me that most people still think adultery is wrong, even though they've had multiple sexual partners outside of marriage and don't really have a sense that your sexuality is something that is to be confined to just one person for the rest of your life. They still feel a horrible sense of betrayal and having been used at the prospect of your spouse being adulterous. In fact, I have a very easy time with my students when I actually talk about sex outside of marriage, and I ask them, how many of you want your spouse to remain faithful to you when you get married for your whole life? And all their hands go up. And I say, how many of you intend to remain faithful to your spouse when you get married? And all their hands went up. And I'd say, why don't you start now? All right, someday you're going to meet the person that you love. And wouldn't it be wonderful to say to that person, I knew you were going to come along someday. And I knew that I would want to make a gift of myself to you in a way in which I've made a gift of myself to no one else. And they start to get it, right? They start to get it. It's like, oh, that's why you wait until marriage, because you want to have this act with the person that you love for the rest of your life. And I want this person to be faithful to me. And if I could be faithful now, it would indicate that I can be faithful then. And why would I want to, in a certain sense, sully this great gift that I have to give to someone? Unfortunately, in our culture, a lot of people think sex is naughty. I mean, it's a bad thing. It's like pornography. And it's things you use people. They use you and you use them. And somehow you're going to get married and it's all going to get all cleaned up and it's going to be wonderful. It doesn't happen that way. But anyway, back to conscience. So you're thinking of adultery. And suddenly you start to understand just what I was saying, the importance of fidelity within marriage. What's the reason for that? So many reasons. I mean, the self-disclosure that is important to intimacy, which requires trust. And the trust that you have of someone that is going to put all their energy and focus on you. And you reciprocally do the same. And you get to know each other in a very deep way. But if you're being betrayed by them sexually, it's next to impossible to do that self-disclosure. They're hurting you so badly, you can no longer have that trust and disclosure. You need to have the intimate, loving relationship that marriage is meant to be. So supposedly when you go through that whole process in John Paul II's time, you say, boy, do I agree with God that adultery is wrong. Well, I absolutely agree. It's not a problem. I want to commit adultery, but I understand that it's wrong. And even that is a little bit of a distortion of the church's view, because the church says it's not hard to understand these truths. There's something that are the universal truths. Adultery is always wrong. All right. And unfortunately, in our culture, what we naturally know has been hard to access because of the malformation that we've received from our culture. If young kids can understand, daddy should love only mommy and mommy should love only daddy, kids, yeah, that's true. They get it right away. They have to live a certain period of time where they begin to think that having sex with a lot of people makes any kind of sense at all. So that's what's called synderesis, is knowing the universal truths. And then the act of conscience is actually trying to figure out whether my behavior is in accord with that universal truth. Say adultery is always wrong. So then the spouse would say, am I having lunch too often with my secretary? Is that threatening the fidelity of my marriage? And conscience is trying to figure out whether a particular action corresponds to a universal truth that is not so hard to know if you weren't malformed by maybe your family or culture, whatever. So the conscience is a constant conversation with God about his universal truths, and then a particular act that you're embarking upon to see whether it corresponds to that universal truth. The modern view is totally different. There's no sense of talking with God. There's no sense of universal objective norms that you have imprinted on your intellect, if you will, that you can naturally know and that you can naturally see are good for you. Instead, it's this view that with every choice you make in this world, and you're good-willed and you're trying hard and you're doing the best you can, and you're choosing different things, and that's forming your conscience. Your conscience is being formed by your experiences and the experiences of your time, of your culture. I mean, most young people think there's absolutely nothing wrong with cohabitation. They actually think it's a good thing, that they would be stupid not to have sex before marriage, that their culture, vast majority of people cohabit before marriage in the United States. And they think, well, if everybody's doing it, it must be good. And it must be a good preparation for marriage. Therefore, when I do it, it's a very good thing. And I know the church teaches this. I had one of my young people I really love tell me the church has a right to its opinion and I have a right to mine. So, well, the church doesn't have opinions. This is a teaching. And he said, I'm going to get married in the church. I said, but what will that mean? I said, you're getting married in a building, but not in the body of Christ. You're not joining Christ. You're not becoming a member of Christ's body and living in accord with the truths that Christ came to teach us. So you're doing something. You really can't be a part of the body of Christ if you are doing if you're cohabiting before marriage. He got it, I think, eventually. He got it. But it's this notion, my conscience says that it's a good thing because I think it's a good thing. I love this person. I think it's smart for us to live together before marriage to see if we're really compatible. And my whole culture does. So my conscience is fine with this. Now, in that latest 571 page tome on moral theology published by the Pontifical Academy for Life, it has this radically different view of conscience. And it has this most incredible position, which is very well critiqued by Cardinal Mueller and Stephen Krampowski in a recent first issue of First Things, where it talks about how they amazingly can say that contraception is, the church's teaching on contraception is true. It's objectively true that the sexual act should remain open to children. It doesn't say it so specifically, but it says, yes, there's objective truths, etc. But more than abiding by objective truths, God wants us to abide by our own values, all right? There is an objective truth, all right? Sure, that's true. But that's not what you're trying to work out. You're not trying to work out what is the objective truth that I need to engage in. It's what are my values and the values of my times that lead me towards what we believe is good. So I need to act in accord with what I've come to believe is good, right? And that's the view of conscience. It's not reading encyclicals, reading the catechism, listening to the church. It's getting in touch with my own values and making sure that I abide by them. And it would almost be, it's called heteronomy in Kant, and John Paul II talks about it in Veritatis Splendor. If I were to live in accord with the church's teaching on cohabitation, I wouldn't be true to myself. I'd be letting someone else dictate morality to me rather than being true to myself. You say, do they don't, they don't follow that in accord with, say, racism. They don't say, okay, yeah, if you truly think other races are inferior, then you should treat them that way. Instead, these same people will say, no, it's objectively true that all human beings are equal. And to be a racist, to be against someone simply because of the color of his skin is really despicable. All right. It's definitely not in accord with God's view of human dignity. And you should let God's view of human dignity form your view. Now, you may have been a person that grew up in a community where a certain racial group was, say, it had a high crime rate, maybe even did vicious things to your daughters. And so you might have a natural reason for hating them. But the church would say, you got to put that aside. That's just a small fraction of that group. And it's not because of their skin color that they act this way. And so you're wrong. You're just flat out wrong. And if those are your values, and even if we can understand why you formed those values, they're wrong. And you have to put them aside and allow yourself to be formed by the truth. They only say this in respect, honestly, to the sexual issues. Every other issue, almost every other issue, there's only one position to take on climate control. There's only one position to take upon, again, LGBTQ issues, racism. There's only one position to take. But all these others, it's get in accord with your own values. And I think it's self-serving. That's how they're living their lives. And so they're promoting that because otherwise they'd have to change.
Janet, that's very important what you said. On the other hand, as you remember, St. Thomas Aquinas said that our conscience can be erroneous, can make mistakes, can recognize the reality, because moral act is also cognition act, right? We need to recognize the reality and then act upon this cognition of the reality. I understand that you accept that there might be moral acts committed with erroneous conscience, which can be sometimes justified, right? So I understand that you're not talking about such situations, right? On the other hand, I understand that someone who does not care about the formation of own conscience is also guilty, right? Because we've got obligation to recognize the reality, the objective truth. Could you comment on that? Because just to square that into the tradition also of St. Thomas.
Yes. Oh, it's an excellent question. And I do think it's behind it. It's used at least as a wedge to put forward this erroneous view of conscience. The church does say, Thomas Aquinas taught that you must always follow your conscience, always, because your conscience is the highest authority you have within. All right. And so even if your conscience is wrong, you need to follow it, right? Meaning what? It doesn't mean that, again, you have to first ask, what question did I ask when I was trying to discern what my conscience tells me to do? Did I ask the question, what do I feel comfortable with? What can I do? I won't feel guilty about it. No, the question is, what does God think about this action? What does God think? That's the question. When I consult my conscience, I'm saying, what does God think about this? All right. And what voice can I hear within of God telling me about this? Now, again, it's not that you just sit in your room and you say, what does God think? You say, again, how would I know what God thinks? I have to do some query. I have to consult whatever I do to consult what God thinks about something. Now, suppose I came up with the wrong answer. Again, I went and talked to, I said, well, I've got to find out from a priest. Priests know God's will. So he's been studied in the seminary. He loves God. I'm going to go ask him. Is it okay that I say, get an abortion? And he hears the young woman's situation. He said, well, in your situation, it would be okay to have an abortion, right? And you've done what you can. Say you're 14, all right? You've asked your mother, you've asked your guidance counselor, you've asked your priest. And they all tell you that in your case, abortion is wrong. Now, you're not if you're 14, I mean, you're not going to be going and read the catechism and the church's documents and everything. You're going to talk to the people that you think you can trust, right? And so your conscience that you've tried to form says, I should get an abortion, all right? I would be disobeying my parents, my guidance counselor, my priest, if somehow I ran away and had this baby. Now, again, if you have that tension within you, of course, it's right to really pay a close attention to that, but who's going to tell the kid that, right? The kid has heard something else. So they have an abortion, right? Now, this young woman, a couple years later, discovers the pro-life message. She hears about the development of the unborn child in the womb. She goes, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I was told it was just a clump of tissue. And then she finds out that the Catholic Church says it's always wrong to get an abortion. She goes, oh my gosh, I can't believe what I did. And she goes to confession. And she says to the priest, Father, I had an abortion when I was 14. And I believe the priest has to say, tell me about it. And she tells him. And he says, I'm so sorry. You were so misled. I'm so very, very sorry you were misled. Abortion, you did kill your own child. I said that, but you're not morally responsible for that, right? You did the best you could, right? You still did wrong, right? You still killed your own child. It's still something you shouldn't have done. It doesn't make your act right. We don't say that because you were subjectively innocent, subjectively non-culpable, that we pat you on the head and we say you did right. Okay, we said you did do the best you could, but you did wrong. Right? I do not believe a penance is warranted in that situation because they thought the young woman thought she was doing right. He might say some prayers if there's any culpability that you might have that we can't discover here in our conversation. But that's what the church means. It doesn't mean whatever as long as you're following your conscience, whatever that means, you've done the right thing. Right? The church doesn't say that. It doesn't say you must follow your conscience, even an erroneous conscience, and thereby you will have done the right thing. All right? The church doesn't say that. It makes the distinction, which you will not find. So I haven't read all 571 pages, but I've gone to the places where you would think you would find this distinction made. So far as I can tell, it doesn't make the distinction between subjective culpability and objective culpability. Right? And that's a very important distinction for the church, that something is objectively wrong and you ought never to do it. All right. But we're supposing those who are subjectively culpable don't know that it's objectively wrong, don't understand why it's objectively wrong, and make a decision apart from being well-formed about objective truth. So you've still done wrong, and you've done a very serious wrong. And unfortunately, a young woman who's had an abortion at 14, who is not subjectively culpable, has already most likely suffered terribly and may suffer terribly for the rest of her life because of that. Just because she was not subjectively culpable, she still lives with the fact that she killed her unborn child. And I don't want her to. I want her to feel completely free from that. But human nature is such that we don't, that when we've done something really wrong, we tend to suffer from it for a very long time, if not forever.
Would suffer from it in the sense of being a victim of somebody else's sin, but not the sinner yourself. Am I understanding you correctly?
Exactly. I mean, I had a friend who ran a pro-life pregnancy help center and would often get women in. He did a support group for women who had had abortions as well. And he said these women were almost crippled in their ability to make decisions, right? Because they said they made a horrible decision in their life and they didn't know who to trust anymore, right? And so forevermore, they felt, I'm the kind of person that can make a decision no matter how excusable that decision was in their particular case. They still don't trust themselves anymore to make decisions. And they wonder what kind of man will love them if this is what they do. And can they really love their children if this is what they've done to one of their children? And again, you try to correct all those falsehoods that they're believing about themselves. And you try to clear those up and tell them why, yes, you can trust yourself. And yes, you can do this. And yes, there will be men who love you and all of that. But it's that suffering to try to get rid of those false beliefs. It's really hard to do, and then all of a sudden you sort of like, I'm the kind of person that did that. You say, yeah, but you live in this culture and it pressured you, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes it's just really hard to lay those views down.
So how do we sort of square that with the concept of acts that are internally intrinsically evil? And what is the relationship there between that objective and subjective guilt? Is that just a factor of sort of shaping somebody's conscience by letting them know that certain acts are always intrinsically evil, or does that play any role in this discernment?
Well, I have a friend who has a large number of children, and she, somewhere around the age of 18 or so, that when they're 18, she starts to talk them again as though they are, and they want to be, and they, in a certain sense, are, responsible moral agents. And she said, my job is now to explain to you what I know as an adult about what the likely consequences are of your actions. And again, the same professor that I had in class that would talk about Medea and Jason, he used to talk about objective reality. He said, if there's an electric fence at the end of the property, and he said, you don't know it's an electric fence, and you go touch that electric fence, he said, you're going to get zapped. He said, you're not knowing that an electric fence doesn't mean that you aren't going to have the consequences of that. I often use the example that if someone puts poison in your orange juice and you don't know there's poison in your orange juice and you drink that orange juice, you're going to suffer the consequences. You're not culpable for having made the bad decision of touching an electric fence and of drinking the orange juice. And the mother said, my job is to identify for them the electric fences that are in the path of the decision that they're about to make, and what's the poison in the orange juice, and say, I'm telling you that if you do this, if you live with this young woman before marriage, this is an electric fence that when you touch it, you get zapped. And they make the decisions. You can't stop them from making their decisions, but again, you form them so they at least have another piece of information that's in their reasoning capacity. So the notion of intrinsic evil is incredibly important. When people say, we did when we were young students, and the same professor, there's no objective truth. And he said, how do we build bridges then? How do we build bridges? I mean, we have to know. We don't build them out of tissue paper. We build them out of steel. Why steel? Because steel has a certain nature. There's a certain reality there. And as much as you would like to build it out of tissue paper because you have more tissue paper than you have steel and it's much less expensive, it's not going to work. And how do we put men on the moon? We put men on the moon because we know things about reality. And when you know things about reality, you can live in accord with it and achieve things. It's the same thing morally. We know the truth about human relationships. We know that cohabitation, fornication, etc., are not good for human beings. They're not good for learning how to be in a relationship and having a lifetime marriage. I mean, again, another thing, it's interesting when I would speak with very young people, teenagers, and sometimes even those in their 20s, there is one thing they really want, and they do want a long, lifetime, lasting marriage. That's what they want, right? They don't want to have 3 marriages, right? There's no way. They've seen the misery. They've been involved in it, or they've seen it with their friends about what happens when a couple divorce and how miserable their children are. The parents always say, they're doing fine. Kids are doing fine. There's an incredible book written by a woman named Lila Miller called Primal Loss that is a series of testimonies of people who now are adults, and they tell how, having been in a family where the parents divorced, what it did to them for the rest of their lives is their ability to relate to other people, have confidence in trust, etc. Even that, I mean, many kids blame themselves for the divorce. They think the parent who left could not really love them because they're obviously the man's not leaving only his wife, he's leaving his children. Woman's not leaving only her husband, she's leaving her children. Well, if she really loved me, she'd stay. But I guess she can't love me. She doesn't love my father, and she doesn't love me either. Otherwise, she'd at least stay for me. So the notion that they are loved, unconditionally loved, and the parent will do anything for them is destroyed. So you try to convince young people of these truths, that these are objective truths. We can, it's a fallen world. So especially in relationships, nothing's 100%. I mean, someone could have had multiple abortions and cohabited and then, converted and had a complete transformation and live a happy life. There's mega amounts of suffering. But let's say I have a friend whose sister actually was married 5 times. And she always seemed a very cheerful, happy person. Maybe she was. I don't know. Maybe she's very shallow. I don't know. So people point at her and say, well, see, she did it. And I'll say, I suspect if you scratched more beneath the surface, you wouldn't find anybody 5 times or 4 times going through a divorce. And the why did you get in this relationship? Why did you get out? How were the children affected? She seems very happy. You talk to her, but I don't know. I doubt it.
Janet, just a quick question, because before this program, I talked to a mother of 3 kids living in Warsaw, and she said, I've got some difficulties in discussion with my adolescent son who doesn't believe in the reasons why we should keep chastity in before marriage. So why should we not cohabit? Why should we keep chaste life instead of sex before marriage? Could you give additional 2-3 arguments for the mother?
For the mother, again, he's largely being driven by the fact that he wants to have sex. Of course, ask him that. I mean, how much do you love this woman? Could you have a relationship with her that doesn't involve sex? Would you? I mean, I remember a young man was being interviewed, and he was being asked whether the woman he was living with now was the woman he intended to marry. And he said, oh, no. He said, I have a couple levels I want to go up on my career first, but, I have sexual desires and she's pretty. And, but, at a certain point, I'll get very serious and find a woman that I want to be with for the rest of my life. And as he said that aloud, he said, oh, I'm really a terrible person, aren't I? He sort of realized he was using that woman, and he hadn't up until that point, because of course she's consenting, whatever that means. I mean, most likely she's hoping it will be a long-term relationship, or she's also using him. He's just a stopgap measure until she finds the one she really wants to live with. And to think about, again, whether you want the person you marry to say to you, I've been waiting for you my whole life, and I knew you'd come along. And so I preserved my sexuality for you. It's something I want to do only with you. So I'm never thinking that I have a better lover than this guy is, right? I'm never comparing him to anyone else. What we have is just between the 2 of us, right? And he's never going to be thinking, did she have better lovers, right? And again, the ability to trust. The thing is, if you can be chaste before marriage, which is unbelievably hard, of course, especially in our culture, if you can do it though, it's almost always because you greatly respect this person. The reason that you are remaining chaste is you say, I would never put this person through the drama of sex outside of marriage. I haven't made a commitment. She hasn't made a commitment. We could walk out tomorrow. That doesn't feel good for anybody. It can be devastating. If I love this person, I don't want to devastate them, all right? If I don't love them, I'm using them, right? So those are my choices. Either I love this person, I don't want her to get pregnant. I don't want her to get pregnant out of wedlock. Oh, well, sure, I'm certain I'll marry her if she gets pregnant. I say, then why not marry her? And just cut out that possibility of the trauma that comes with an out of wedlock pregnancy, comes out of the trauma of living together for a year and a half and then moving out. Even getting married, you're not exactly certain whether you're getting married because you really carefully discerned this relationship, or because I call it sliding into marriage. It's like, oh yeah, we're having sex, we're renting an apartment, we have a dog and a couch, and who decides who gets what. I want to get married. Sex is pretty good. We don't fight that much. Might as well get married. I have people tell me that's exactly the reasoning that they went through when they were discerning marriage with the person they were cohabiting with. And then you get married and it's a whole new story, right? When you're cohabiting, the door is always a little bit cracked open. I can leave when I want to. Marriage, as you know, is either incredibly liberating. It's sort of like, wow, I found a person that wants to spend the rest of their life with me, made a lifetime commitment with me, and we're gonna work it out. No matter what trouble there is, we're gonna work it out. We're gonna have children. We thought about this. We share values, etc. I know it's going to be hard. Everybody tells us it's going to be hard. Everybody says it's going to be hard. So I guess it's going to be hard, but we're convinced we can overcome it. As opposed to saying we're cohabiting. And if it gets really hard, I can leave. Doors open. All right. And so but at the same time, you're really afraid the other person might leave. And so you're on what's called your best behavior, right? As one person said, you're auditioning for marriage. Right? I don't want him to know who I really am, because if I let him know who I really am, he might leave. And I know he likes this. I don't much care about that, but I'm going to do it because I want to sort of bring him in. And then after marriage, you start being who you really are. And you say, he doesn't much like who I really am. Right? And it's, if you're not having sex before marriage, you have this incredible freedom. You're driving home. And as you're driving home, you're thinking about, what was this night like? How are things going? Is he really for me? Is she really for me? And you go home and you might talk to your mother, your father, your best friend, your sister, and you really wrestle things out. If you're going to bed with each other that night, you overlook a lot, right? You don't want to fight. You don't want to fight when you go to bed. You don't want to fight at breakfast. You don't want to break up. So there's all sorts of things that people don't talk about when they're cohabiting that they need to talk about in order to make sure they should get married. Do we want to go to church? It often happens after marriage. After a year or two of marriage, one of them says, I want to go back to church. The other says, what do you mean church? We never did any church. We've not done any church. Well, I'm hoping we'll start a family soon, and I'd like to raise our family in the church. Start a family soon. What are you talking about? I thought we'd go 5 or 6 years without kids anyway, just to travel the world. Well, my biological time clock is running out, and I thought we'd, have 3, 4, 5 kids, And he says, what? I certainly don't want more than 2. And you have these conversations that are deal breakers, and you should have had them long before you get married. Maybe within the first 3 months of courtship, bring up the stuff, all right, and say, this is really important to me. And you haven't developed a way of working out relationships, and you don't have that cushion that this will never end in divorce. All right. The cushion of never ending in divorce. I had a friend who said, I just knew that whatever problem we had, we'd work it out because we didn't believe in divorce. But if you've been cohabiting, you believe in breaking up intimate relationships, because that's what it's all about. We're testing this out.
Janet, one area which we need to cover also is religious freedom, freedom of conscience in Western culture. Do you see this trend that in US and Western world, intolerance to Catholicism, to natural law is growing, that doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs are persecuted in the workplace because of their beliefs? Do you see this kind of developments in US? We've heard about.
Again, when people no longer believe, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Could you comment? Is it changing? Is our society against the Christian freedom, Christian values? So people might not survive in the workplace, like during Obamacare discussions, or nowadays under Biden, which is pushing a lot abortion for everyone.
Oh, yes, freedom of conscience. Again, it depends what you mean by conscience. That was developed on the notion that there was some objective truth, and you were prepared to make huge personal sacrifices to live in accord with that objective truth. And so when you said, my conscience tells me that I can't perform abortions, you might even want to say, I would like to, because I want to keep this job, but I can't do it because there's an objective truth. Now, you want those people in your culture because it's going to be harder for that person to become a Nazi. Right? Because if someone's, as our culture now tells us, unless you approve of these many pronouns, unless you will do an abortion, unless you will do a procedure to help someone change their physical appearance of their sex, so they look more like the other sex, unless you do that, you can't keep your job, right? And we want people who will say, I won't do it because it's wrong. Because in the history of mankind, when people start saying, I'll do whatever the government tells me to, because I want a comfortable life, and I won't have a comfortable life unless I do what the government tells me to, we don't want those people, right? But because we want people to live in accord with the objective truth. But now that people talk about conscience in these personal values, it's sort of like, well, you don't want to do abortions. That's like saying, like, you don't like green hair. It's just a personal preference. And so why should we honor your preference as opposed to this woman's need or desire for an abortion? You should do it because your conscience doesn't really matter. Your conscience is just your preferences or your values. And so our whole different view of there's no such thing as right and wrong. If you don't want to do something, it's not because you think it's wrong. Well, you speak that way, but you don't know how to talk right about morality. You're just saying you don't want to do that because you don't like it. It's not your preference to do that. And so we lose any sense of conscience when we lose objective reality. So the notion of a person has a right to conscience, for now, that just extends just so far as another person's want or need. They want something. You should if someone said, but I in my conscience, I have to be able to dye my hair green. You say, okay, dye your hair green. But that's not a matter of conscience. That's a matter of taste. But people don't make those distinctions anymore. So the notion of a right to conscience is being so rapidly eroded, largely because we don't believe in objective truth and we don't understand what the conscience really is. So why have a right? What does a right to conscience mean? A right to act on my preference when it stands in the way of someone else's choice. We want freedom of choice for everybody. And my freedom of choice not to do something doesn't count when the culture thinks that abortion is just fine.
So am I right to conclude that you see these trends in US and you see the doctors, teachers who are persecuted, who are fired from the work for not doing things which are against their conscience? So the clause of conscience or some kind of protection of the personal conscience is not anymore ensured in some cases like California or New York, whatever. You see this kind of trends in US because it's coming slowly to Poland, but I understand that in the US there were a number of cases, people who were fired because they refused.
It's rampant right now. I mean, we've certainly seen it during the COVID pandemic. You had all these doctors who thought that it made sense to do some preventative that there were treatments to keep you out of the hospital, like using ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine or whatever. And they thought there's good studies, there's respected studies in journals, and but the government decided those weren't permissible. And so doctors who said, but it works for my patients. I've treated 600 patients, and every one of them's gotten better. No one's gone in the hospital. And they say, no, you can't do that. And they lose their jobs. And these are doctors that have published from here to forever in academic journals, who have an unblemished record, but they say, no, you can't do that because we say what you do as a doctor. And it's all over the place now. And so it's, it's not just something on the horizon. It's been something, I mean, for a long time, young people have not gone into obstetrics and gynecology because of the pressure to do an abortion during medical school. And that they just say, I don't want to fight that fight. I don't want to fight that battle. Instead, they go into some other branch of medicine. So it's not as if you can say, my conscience tells me that I can't do this. It's like, we don't respect that. It's just your preference.
Is this a winnable fight? If they go into obstetrics and gynecology and they refuse to perform these procedures in school, can they still graduate?
I despair about a lot of things. So I on a natural plane, it's hard for me to see how we get out of the mess we're in. Of course, I believe in the Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit has a way, and that's what I have to believe in. But the natural law does assert itself finally. I mean, this whole transgenderism business where women's sports are being destroyed by men who are biologically males who claim to be female. And some of them don't even undergo any kind of hormonal treatment or anything. They're still totally intact as a male with all his testosterone and everything and all his natural muscle build. Yeah, he can beat any female in track or swimming or whatever. It's destroying women's sports. There's a man named Matt Walsh in the United States who's a commentator, and he lives in Tennessee now. And he's discovered that the University of Vanderbilt has a transgender clinic there that takes teenage girls and does double mastectomies on them and takes flesh from their arm that they turn into a phony penis. All right, 14-year-old girls. And they have videos of them saying, we're doing this because it's incredibly profitable. That we make an enormous amount of money on the surgery, and then for the rest of their lives they have to come in for follow-up treatment with hormones, etc. It's an incredibly wealthy branch of medicine. They have videos with officials saying this. He's exposing all of it, right? And one hopes, and I think natural law will assert itself, that fathers and mothers will say, this is so unfair to our girls in sports. And even some very prominent feminists are saying, you're ruining women's sports. You can't let this happen. And now we have parents, legislators in Tennessee saying, where there's no way we're paying for this at a state university. This is insane. We're going to have laws against this exploitation of confused 14-year-old girls who think they're males. And that's natural law kicking in a, you wonder how it would ever happened, but that's how malformed we are in respect to natural law. It's unbelievable that school boards and hospitals would allow these things, that there's rational human beings sitting around, or that in a sports commission they're sitting saying, oh yeah, this 17-year-old boy, he wants to be in the girls' swim meet. Well, he says he's female, we have to let him. These people, who are they? And why have they left their brain at the door? And that some of these are parents. You're saying, how can don't you have a daughter? Don't you have a son? Anyway, so I'm hoping that it'll be sort of an emperor's, that fairy tale about the emperor has no clothes, that there was an emperor who was being deceived that he had no clothes. He was naked, and his vicious servants were telling him he had just put on a beautiful cloak and he put on a beautiful thing, but he was naked, but he believed them. And so he went in a parade, absolutely naked. And he thought he was ordained in beautiful garments. And some little kid in the crowd turns to his mother and says, Mom, why does the emperor have no clothes? And then everybody said, right, he doesn't have any clothes, right? You needed someone to blow the whistle on this. It really is mass delusion. Somehow these false views, and I think it goes back to personal morality. It's people are saying, I want to do whatever I want to do. So how can I stop you from doing whatever you want to do? And that's a kind of a principle. It's like, I know I'm doing immoral things. I'm fornicating, I'm cohabiting, I'm using contraception, I'm looking at porn, I'm doing whatever. I'm embezzling, I'm cheating on my taxes, I'm doing immoral things. And if I start preaching morality to you, then it comes back on me and I'd have to change, and I don't want to change. And I think that is so much behind so much of this. Why would anybody tolerate any of this? To tolerate boys in girls' restrooms and changing rooms and on the teams. It makes no sense.
Professor, it's been a great pleasure. I think we are running close to our time limit. So, Piotr, in both of our names, let me thank Professor Smith cordially for her participation and sharing her wisdom with us. And if you would like to say a couple of last words to our listeners and viewers here in Poland, maybe a piece of good advice, maybe a warning, then please do.
Well, we depend upon Poland. I mean, it's one of the countries that still has a strong, at least as far as we can see, a much stronger basis of faith and common sense than we have. And I feel like you're turning to me to see what the future might be if you completely come over to our side of things. We've sold our patrimony for really deviant sexual pleasure, I would say. The patrimony we've had in the United States of an incredible constitution, incredible belief in the common person to have good sense in fair elections, and all sorts of things that have guided this country for all of its existence. In the last 50 years, and very rapidly in the last 10, is absolutely crumbling. So we look to many European countries, Hungary, Poland, a few others, to say, please teach us again how to do this life thing, because we're blowing it big time. So we need models. And so I just ask you to be the best of Poland and help save us from our own self-destructive tendencies we have here.
Well, we are an unworthy vessel, so it's everything. It's in the hands of the Lord. I think
Right.
the battle is won, as the Lord promised. We might not live to see it, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we are on the right side.
It's a privilege to be in the battle. I mean, I've spent a lot of my life thinking the world evil has been defeated. It's been sometimes I think if I write an autobiography, which I don't intend to do, but it'd be something like, the consequences of criminal naivete on my part. That I've been very naive about evil and the presence of evil and the difficulty in eradicating evil, and felt very safe. We're not going to be attacked. We're going to be materially prosperous, all sorts of things. And now I feel all of it just hangs in the balance and is in the hands of some pretty evil people, the things that I value the most. So I'm waking up. It's not pleasant, but as you say, the battle has been won. And God chose us to live in this time. And it's a privilege to be a soldier in the Lord's army. Even if we get beaten and mauled, and I've led an easy life, and I still do. The prospect that when I read the lives of martyrs, I think, I can't imagine myself having that kind of endurance and courage and fidelity and persistence. But he's asked me to do this little thing, so I'm going to do the best I can do at that, and hope if he asks better things of me, he'll give me the bigger things. He'll give me the grace to do it.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith, and hopefully it's not our last meeting. So God bless you, and thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for participation. We will make the Polish version of this program, and next month I invite you for the interview with Steve Mosher, an excellent expert on China and the whole situation of Christians in China. So that would be in the second part of October. So welcome you already now, and thank you very much once again, Dr. Smith. Goodbye to everyone.
Good night, and God bless you.
God bless you.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions. It's been wonderful. Thank you.